I never thought I'd find myself standing in the driveway of my suburban Boston home, watching flames devour every piece of clothing I owned. But there I was, on a crisp autumn evening, the air thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burning fabric. My husband Tom's face was contorted with rage, his usual calm demeanor shattered like glass on concrete. Next to him stood his mother, Evelyn, her thin lips curled into a triumphant smirk that made my stomach churn. It hadn't always been like this. When Tom and I first met at a local coffee shop 5 years ago, I thought I'd found my soulmate. He was charming, attentive, and seemed to genuinely care about my thoughts and feelings. We laughed over steaming lattes, shared our dreams, and fell in love amidst the bustling streets of Boston. Our wedding day, just 18 months later, was filled with hope and promises of a bright future together. But as the months rolled by, the man I married began to fade away, replaced by someone I barely recognized. It started small, a dismissive comment here, a cold shoulder there. Then came the constant criticism, always delivered with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Sarah, darling," he'd say, his voice dripping with condescension, "don't you think you should try a little harder with dinner? My mother's pot roast is to die for." Ah, yes. Evelyn. My mother-in-law swept into our lives like a hurricane, leaving destruction in her wake. She moved in with us shortly after the wedding, citing loneliness and a desire to be closer to her precious boy. At first, I tried to welcome her, to build a relationship with the woman who had raised the man I loved. But it quickly became clear that in Evelyn's eyes, I would never be good enough for her son. Every day became a battle. Evelyn nitpicked everything I did, from the way I folded laundry to how I arranged flowers in the living room. "Oh, Sarah," she'd sigh, shaking her head with exaggerated disappointment, "I suppose you just weren't raised to understand these things. Let me show you how it's done." And Tom? He stood by silently, watching as his mother slowly chipped away at my confidence, my sense of self-worth. I tried to talk to Tom about it, to make him see how his mother's behavior was affecting me. But he always brushed off my concerns. "Mom's just set in her ways," he'd say with a shrug. "She means well. You need to learn to get along with her." And so, I swallowed my pride, bit my tongue, and tried to be the perfect wife and daughter-in-law they both seemed to expect. But tonight, something inside me snapped. It was a simple thing, really. Evelyn had asked me to prepare her favorite meal, a complicated French dish that I'd never attempted before. I spent hours in the kitchen, following the recipe to the letter, determined to prove that I could do this one thing right. When I finally served dinner, my hands shaking slightly as I set the plates on the table, Evelyn took one bite and promptly spat it out. "This is inedible," she declared, pushing her plate away with a look of disgust. "I can't believe you'd serve this to your family. Thomas, darling, I think it's time we discussed finding someone more capable to take care of the household duties." I felt something break inside me at that moment. Years of pent-up frustration and hurt came pouring out. "I've had enough," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I've tried for years to please you both, but nothing I do is ever good enough. I'm done." The silence that followed was deafening. Tom's face darkened, his eyes flashing with anger. Without a word, he stormed out of the dining room and up the stairs. I heard drawers being yanked open, closet doors slamming. When he came back down, his arms were full of my clothes, everything from my favorite jeans to the delicate lace dress I'd worn on our first anniversary. "If you're done," he snarled, "then you won't be needing these anymore." And with that, he marched out the front door. I followed, confusion and fear battling for dominance in my mind. In the driveway, Tom dumped my clothes in a heap. From his pocket, he produced a lighter. "Tom," I gasped, realization dawning. "What are you doing?" He didn't answer. With a flick of his thumb, the lighter sparked to life. In seconds, the small flame caught on the edge of my favorite sweater, then spread rapidly through the pile. I watched in horror as years of memories went up in smoke, the dress I wore to my college graduation, the lucky t-shirt I'd had since high school, the scarf my grandmother had knitted for me before she passed away. Evelyn appeared in the doorway, her face lit by the dancing flames. She looked satisfied, as if this was the outcome she'd been pushing for all along. Tom turned to me, his eyes cold and unfamiliar. "If you don't like it, sign the divorce papers and leave," he spat. "You're as good as worthless to me if you won't listen." In that moment, something shifted inside me. The fear and confusion melted away, replaced by a strange sense of calm. I looked at Tom, really looked at him, and saw not the man I'd fallen in love with, but a stranger consumed by anger and his mother's toxic influence. I glanced at Evelyn, her smug expression illuminated by the dying embers of my possessions, and felt nothing but pity. Without a word, I walked back into the house. On the kitchen table lay a stack of papers, divorce documents that Tom must have had prepared, just waiting for this moment. I picked up a pen, my hand steady as I signed my name on each marked line. There was no hesitation, no second thoughts. Just the certainty that this chapter of my life was ending, and a new one was about to begin. I set the pen down and looked up to find Tom watching me from the doorway. His expression was a mix of surprise and something else, regret, perhaps? But it was too late for that now. "Okay," I said simply, my voice calm and clear. I grabbed my purse from the hook by the door, checking to make sure my wallet and phone were inside. They were the only possessions I had left now, but somehow, I felt lighter than I had in years. As I walked out the front door for the last time, I heard Evelyn's shrill voice behind me. "Good riddance," she hissed. "You were never good enough for my Thomas." I didn't look back. The night air was cool on my face as I made my way down the driveway, past the smoldering remains of my old life. My feet carried me down the familiar streets of our neighborhood, past the park where Tom and I used to have picnics, past the elementary school where we'd talked about sending our future children. Each step took me further away from the prison my marriage had become and closer to an uncertain but hopeful future. I walked for what felt like hours, my mind racing with questions and possibilities. Where would I go? What would I do? I had no clothes, no place to stay, and very little money of my own. But despite the challenges ahead, I felt a sense of freedom I hadn't experienced in years. As I reached the end of our street, I pulled out my phone. My thumb hovered over the contacts list, scrolling past names I hadn't spoken to in far too long. Friends and family I'd slowly lost touch with as my world had shrunk to revolve around Tom and Evelyn's demands. And then I saw it, a name that made my heart lift slightly. Sophia. Sophia had been my best friend in college, the kind of friend who knew me better than I knew myself sometimes. We'd drifted apart after I got married, our occasional catch-up calls becoming less and less frequent. The last time we'd spoken, she'd expressed concern about my relationship with Tom, sensing something was off even through the facade I'd carefully constructed. I'd brushed off her worries then, insisting everything was fine. Now, I wondered if she'd seen the truth long before I was ready to admit it to myself. With a deep breath, I pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. I was about to hang up when I heard a familiar voice. "Sarah, is that you?" The sound of Sophia's voice, warm and concerned, broke something inside me. Tears I hadn't allowed myself to shed earlier now flowed freely down my cheeks. "Sophia," I choked out. "I need help." There was a brief pause, and then Sophia's voice came through the line, strong and sure. "Where are you?" "I'm coming to get you." As I gave her my location, I felt a glimmer of hope spark in my chest. This wasn't the end. It was a beginning. And for the first time in years, I was ready to see where this new path might lead. Sophia arrived in what felt like minutes, though I knew it must have been at least half an hour. I was sitting on a bench in a small park not far from where I'd made the call, my mind still reeling from the events of the evening. When I saw her car pull up, a wave of relief washed over me so strongly that my knees nearly buckled as I stood. She didn't say a word at first, just wrapped me in a tight hug that spoke volumes. The familiar scent of her perfume, something floral and comforting, brought back memories of late-night study sessions and shared dreams of the future. How had I let this friendship slip away? "Oh, Sarah," Sophia murmured as she pulled back, her dark eyes scanning my face with concern. "Let's get you out of here." The drive to Sophia's apartment was a blur. I stared out the window, watching the familiar streets of Boston pass by, each mile taking me further from the life I'd known. Sophia didn't press me for details, instead filling the silence with gentle reassurances and promises that everything would be okay. It wasn't until we were settled in her cozy living room, mugs of steaming tea in our hands, that the story came pouring out of me. I told her everything. The slow erosion of my marriage, Evelyn's constant criticism, the feeling of suffocation that had been building for years. When I got to the part about Tom burning my clothes, Sophia's grip on her mug tightened, her knuckles turning white. "That absolute jerk," she hissed, her usually calm demeanor cracking. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I knew something was off, but I had no idea it was this bad." I shook my head, a rueful smile tugging at my lips. I didn't want anyone to know. I kept thinking if I just tried harder, if I could be perfect, things would get better. The words tasted bitter on my tongue, the full weight of my self-deception hitting me. Sophia reached out, placing her hand over mine. "This isn't your fault, Sarah. You hear me? None of this is your fault." That night, curled up on Sophia's spare bed in borrowed pajamas, I cried myself to sleep. But for the first time in years, they weren't tears of frustration or despair. They were tears of release, of letting go of the person I'd forced myself to be for so long. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Sophia, ever the practical one, helped me make lists of everything I needed to do. First on the agenda was clothes. I couldn't keep borrowing hers forever. We hit up some second-hand stores, piecing together a basic wardrobe that felt more me than anything I'd worn in years. "You know," Sophia mused as I twirled in a flowy sundress that Tom would have deemed too frivolous, "I'd forgotten how much I missed your style." I grinned, a genuine smile that felt foreign on my face. I'd forgotten I had a style. Next came the practical matters. I needed a job, a place to live, a plan for the future. It was overwhelming, but Sophia broke it down into manageable steps. We updated my resume, trawling through my work history to highlight skills I'd forgotten I had. I'd been a marketing whiz in college. How had I let that part of myself fade away? "You're still in there," Sophia assured me one night as we pored over job listings. The Sarah I knew in college, bright, ambitious, full of ideas. She's just been buried for a while. I wasn't so sure, but I was determined to try. Each small decision, choosing an outfit, applying for a job, even just deciding what to have for dinner, felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. A week after I'd walked out of my old life, Sophia introduced me to her friend Rachel, a lawyer specializing in divorce cases. "Just to know your options," Sophia explained as we walked into Rachel's office. Rachel was a petite woman with a no-nonsense attitude that immediately put me at ease. As I recounted my story, this time with a bit more distance and clarity, her expression grew increasingly serious. "Sarah," she said when I'd finished, leaning forward in her chair, "what Tom did wasn't just cruel. It was abusive, and potentially illegal. Destroying your property like that. There are laws against that kind of behavior during a divorce." I blinked, taken aback. "But we weren't divorced yet when he did it." Rachel's smile was sharp. "Doesn't matter. The moment you signed those papers, it became relevant to the divorce proceedings. And let me tell you, judges don't look kindly on that sort of vindictive behavior." For the first time, I allowed myself to feel a flicker of anger. Not the helpless frustration I'd grown accustomed to, but a righteous indignation that made my spine straighten. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Rachel replied, her eyes glinting, "that we have options. If you want to pursue this, we could potentially seek compensation for the destroyed property, as well as emotional damages. It won't undo what happened, but it could give you a financial cushion to rebuild your life." I left Rachel's office with a lot to think about. Part of me wanted to just walk away, to leave Tom and that whole life behind me. But another part, a part that was growing stronger every day, wanted justice. Not revenge, but accountability. That night, I tossed and turned, my mind racing. I thought about all the times I'd swallowed my hurt, made myself smaller to avoid rocking the boat. I thought about other women who might be in similar situations, feeling trapped and alone. And I thought about Tom and Evelyn, probably congratulating themselves on getting rid of me so easily. By morning, I'd made my decision. I called Rachel and told her I wanted to move forward with the case. The next few weeks were a blur of legal consultations, paperwork, and preparation. Rachel and her team were thorough, documenting every instance of mistreatment I could remember. It was painful, dredging up memories I'd tried to bury, but also cathartic. Each recollection, each piece of evidence we gathered, felt like shedding another layer of the person I'd been forced to become. Meanwhile, life went on. I landed a job at a small marketing firm, nothing fancy but a start. The owner, a woman named Diane, took a chance on me despite my gap in employment. "We all have chapters we'd rather forget," she said with a knowing look when I tried to explain my situation. "What matters is where you go from here." I threw myself into the work, rediscovering skills I'd thought long forgotten. Each successful project, each word of praise from Diane or my coworkers, built my confidence a little more. I started to remember the person I used to be: driven, creative, full of ideas. Sophia was my rock through it all. She celebrated every small victory with me, from my first paycheck to the day I found a tiny studio apartment I could afford on my own. "Look at you," she said proudly as we lugged a second-hand couch up the narrow stairs. "Phoenix rising from the ashes." I rolled my eyes, but couldn't hide my smile. "Isn't that a bit dramatic?" "Honey," Sophia laughed, "after what you've been through, you've earned a little drama." As the weeks turned into months, I settled into my new life. The fear and uncertainty that had plagued me in those first days began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of possibility. I rediscovered old hobbies: painting, reading for pleasure, taking long walks through the city I'd once loved but had stopped seeing. I made new friends at work, started volunteering at a local women's shelter, slowly rebuilding a social circle that was truly my own. But even as I moved forward, I couldn't forget what I'd left behind. The court date for my divorce case loomed on the horizon, a reminder that this chapter of my life wasn't fully closed. Rachel assured me we had a strong case, but the thought of facing Tom and Evelyn again filled me with a mix of dread and determination. The night before the hearing, I stood in front of the mirror in my tiny bathroom, studying my reflection. The woman looking back at me was different from the one who had walked out of that burning driveway months ago. My hair was shorter, streaked with highlights Sophia had convinced me to try. My posture was straighter, my eyes clearer. I looked like myself. "You've got this," I told my reflection, squaring my shoulders. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you've already won." As I turned away from the mirror, my phone buzzed with a text from Sophia: "All set for tomorrow. Remember, I'll be right there with you. You're not alone." I smiled, feeling a surge of gratitude for the friend who had been my lifeline. No, I wasn't alone. Not anymore. And whatever the next chapter held, I was ready to face it, on my own terms. The morning of the court hearing dawned crisp and clear, a perfect New England autumn day. I woke before my alarm, my stomach a knot of nervous energy. As I went through my morning routine, shower, coffee, outfit I'd laid out the night before, I tried to channel that energy into determination. Today wasn't just about facing Tom and Evelyn, it was about standing up for myself, maybe for the first time in years. Sophia arrived right on schedule, armed with coffee and bagels. "Breakfast of champions," she announced, setting the paper bag on my tiny kitchen counter. "You ready for this?" I took a deep breath, smoothing down my blazer. It was new, well, new to me from a consignment shop, and made me feel professional, put together. Like someone who deserved to be taken seriously. As ready as I'll ever be. The ride to the courthouse was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I watched the familiar Boston streets roll by, remembering how just a few months ago, I'd felt like a stranger in my own life. Now, despite the nerves fluttering in my stomach, I felt grounded. Present in a way I hadn't been in years. Rachel met us on the courthouse steps, her briefcase in one hand and a tablet in the other. "Good morning, Sarah," she said, her tone brisk but kind. "How are you feeling?" "Nervous," I admitted. "But ready." She nodded approvingly. "Good. Remember, we've prepared for this. You know your story better than anyone. Just tell the truth, and let me handle the rest." As we walked into the courthouse, I caught sight of a familiar figure, Tom, standing with his lawyer and, of course, Evelyn. My steps faltered for a moment, a wave of old fear washing over me. Tom looked smaller somehow. Less intimidating than the larger-than-life figure he'd become in my mind. Evelyn, on the other hand, looked ready for battle, her eyes narrowing as she spotted me. Sophia squeezed my arm. "Eyes forward," she murmured. "They can't hurt you anymore. The next few hours passed in a blur of legal procedures and testimonies. I sat at the table with Rachel, trying to keep my expression neutral as Tom's lawyer presented their side of the story. They painted a picture of me as unstable, ungrateful, someone who had walked out on a perfectly good marriage on a whim. It was hard to hear, to see Tom nodding along as if this version of events was the absolute truth. But then it was our turn. Rachel stood, her posture confident, her voice clear. "Your Honor, we're here today not just to finalize a divorce, but to seek justice for a pattern of emotional abuse and financial misconduct." She laid out our case methodically, presenting evidence of Tom's controlling behavior, the isolation from friends and family, the gradual erosion of my independence. When she got to the incident with my clothes, I heard a few gasps from the gallery. And then it was my turn to speak. As I took the stand, I caught Sophia's eye. She gave me a subtle thumbs up, and I felt a surge of courage. "Mrs. Henderson," the judge said, his tone neutral, "please tell us in your own words what led to the dissolution of your marriage." I took a deep breath and began to speak. I told them about the early days, how happy we'd been. About the gradual changes, the criticism that became constant, the way my world had shrunk to revolve around Tom and Evelyn's demands. I described the night Tom burned my clothes, my voice only shaking a little as I recounted standing there, watching years of memories go up in smoke. "And why didn't you leave sooner?" Tom's lawyer asked during cross-examination, his tone suggesting he'd caught me in a lie. I met his gaze steadily. "Because I loved my husband. Because I thought if I just tried harder, things would get better. Because somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten that I deserved better." Throughout my testimony, I avoided looking at Tom or Evelyn. But as I stepped down from the stand, I caught a glimpse of Tom's face. He looked shocked, as if he was hearing this version of our marriage for the first time. Evelyn, on the other hand, was scowling, whispering furiously to their lawyer. The rest of the hearing passed quickly. The judge listened to closing arguments from both sides, his expression thoughtful. When he finally spoke, his words sent a jolt through me. "Based on the evidence presented, I find that Mr. Henderson's actions constitute emotional abuse and willful destruction of property. Mrs. Henderson is entitled to compensation for her destroyed belongings, as well as a larger share of the marital assets to account for lost economic opportunities during the marriage." I sat there, stunned, as Rachel squeezed my hand. We'd won. Not just the divorce, but acknowledgement of what I'd been through. Validation that I wasn't crazy, that the things I'd experienced weren't normal or okay. As we left the courtroom, I felt lighter than I had in years. Tom tried to approach me, his expression a mix of anger and something that might have been regret, but Sophia and Rachel quickly flanked me, creating a protective barrier. "It's over, Tom," I said quietly. "Please, just let it be over." He opened his mouth as if to argue, but then Evelyn was there, pulling him away, her voice shrill as she berated him for losing the case. I watched them go, feeling a strange mix of pity and relief. They were no longer my problem. Outside, the autumn sun was warm on my face. Sophia pulled me into a hug, laughing. "You did it. God, Sarah, you were amazing in there." Rachel was more reserved, but I could see the satisfaction in her eyes. "It was a good outcome," she said. "The compensation should give you a solid foundation to rebuild." I nodded, still processing. "Thank you. Both of you. I couldn't have done this without you." We went out for lunch to celebrate, toasting with sparkling cider. "It's a bit early for champagne," Sophia had laughed. As we ate, I found myself making plans, real plans, for the first time in ages. The compensation would allow me to take some classes, maybe even start my own small marketing consultancy. "Look at you," Sophia said fondly. "I can practically see the wheels turning." I grinned, feeling a rush of excitement. There's just so much possibility now. It's a little overwhelming, honestly. Rachel nodded understandingly. "It's normal to feel that way. You've been through a lot, and now you're facing a whole new chapter. Just remember, you don't have to figure it all out at once." Later that evening, back in my tiny apartment, I sat on the windowsill, looking out at the city lights. The events of the day were still sinking in, the victory in court, the plans for the future, the realization that I was truly free to shape my life however I wanted. I thought about the woman I'd been just a few months ago, standing in that driveway watching my possessions burn. I wished I could go back and tell her that it would be okay, that this moment of destruction would lead to rebirth. That she was stronger than she knew. My phone buzzed with a text from Sophia, still riding that victory high. Don't forget, brunch tomorrow to continue the celebration. I smiled, typing back a quick reply. Then, on impulse, I opened my laptop and started a new document. Rising from the ashes, a survivor's guide to rebuilding, I typed at the top. I wasn't sure what it would become, a blog, a book, maybe just a personal journal. But I knew I wanted to document this journey, to maybe help other women who found themselves where I had been. As I began to write, I felt a sense of purpose settling over me. The road ahead wasn't clear, and I knew there would be challenges. Rebuilding a life from scratch isn't easy. But for the first time in years, I was excited about the future. Whatever came next, I would face it on my own terms, with my head held high. The girl who had walked out of that burning driveway might have been broken, but the woman sitting here now? She was ready to set the world on fire, in all the best ways. In the weeks following the court hearing, life settled into a new rhythm. I threw myself into work, impressing Diane with my dedication and fresh ideas. My tiny apartment began to feel like home, filled with second-hand furniture and the few mementos I'd managed to salvage from my old life. Slowly but surely, I was rebuilding. But even as I moved forward, I couldn't help wondering about Tom and Evelyn. How were they handling the aftermath of the court's decision? I hadn't heard a peep from either of them since that day, and I told myself that was a good thing. Clean break and all that. It was a crisp Saturday morning when the storm finally broke. I was at my favorite coffee shop, laptop open as I worked on my blog. Rising from the ashes had started as a personal project, a way to process everything I'd been through. But to my surprise, it had started to gain a following. Women from all over were reaching out, sharing their own stories of survival and rebirth. I was deep in concentration, editing my latest post, when a shadow fell across my table. I looked up, expecting to see a barista offering a refill. Instead, I found myself staring into the face of my former neighbor, Linda. Sarah. Her voice was hesitant, her eyes wide with surprise. I thought that was you. I smiled, gesturing for her to sit. Linda and I had never been close, Evelyn's influence had made sure of that, but she'd always been kind. It's good to see you, Linda. How have you been? She settled into the chair across from me, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern. I've been well, thank you. But Sarah, is it true? What they're saying about Tom? My heart skipped a beat. What are they saying? Linda leaned in, lowering her voice. It's all over the neighborhood. Apparently, 2 men in suits showed up at your old house last week. Legal types, from what I heard. Tom's been, well, he's not been himself since. I sat back, processing this information. Part of me wanted to ask for more details, to know exactly what was happening. But another part, the part that had worked so hard to move on, held back. I'm not really in touch with Tom anymore, I said carefully. Whatever's going on, I'm sure he'll handle it. Linda nodded, but I could see the questions burning in her eyes. Before she could ask anything else, I steered the conversation to safer topics, her grandkids, the unseasonably warm weather. By the time she left, promising to stay in touch, my mind was whirling. I tried to focus on my writing, but the words wouldn't come. Finally, I packed up my things and headed home, my thoughts a tangled mess. As I walked, I found myself taking a familiar route, not to my new apartment, but towards the house I'd once shared with Tom. I told myself I was just being curious, that there was no harm in walking down memory lane. But as I rounded the corner onto Tom's, street, I felt my pulse quicken. And then I saw it. There, parked in front of the house, was a sleek black car I didn't recognize. 2 men in sharp suits were climbing out, briefcases in hand. Even from a distance, I could see the grim determination on their faces. I ducked behind a nearby tree, my heart pounding. What was going on? Were these the same men Linda had mentioned? As I watched, the front door opened. Tom emerged, looking different. His usually impeccable appearance was disheveled, his hair unkempt. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. The men approached, their postures radiating authority. I was too far away to hear what they were saying, but I saw Tom's face pale. He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture I remembered all too well. Just then, a shrill voice cut through the air. Evelyn appeared in the doorway, her face twisted with anger. "Thomas, don't you dare speak to them without me." One of the men turned to her, saying something that made her recoil as if she'd been slapped. I watched, fascinated, as the dynamics I'd known for so long seemed to crumble before my eyes. The group disappeared into the house, leaving me standing there, hidden and conflicted. Part of me felt a grim satisfaction. After everything Tom and Evelyn had put me through, seeing them face consequences felt like justice. But another part of me, a part one wasn't entirely comfortable with, felt a twinge of pity. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. This wasn't my problem anymore. I had my own life to focus on, my own battles to fight. With a deep breath, I turned and walked away, forcing myself not to look back. That night, I tossed and turned, unable to shake the image of Tom's haggard face from my mind. Around 2 a.m., I gave up on sleep and pulled out my laptop. Almost without thinking, I found myself on social media, something I'd avoided for months. Tom's profile was still public. As I scrolled through, I felt like I was looking at a stranger's life. Photos of business dinners, golf outings, forced smiles with Evelyn always hovering nearby. But the most recent posts were different. Vague statements about challenging times and personal growth. The comments were a mix of concern and thinly veiled curiosity. I closed the laptop, feeling unsettled. What was I doing? I'd worked so hard to move on, to build a life that didn't revolve around Tom and Evelyn. And yet here I was, in the middle of the night, cyberstalking my ex-husband. The next morning, I woke to a flurry of text messages from Sophia. "Have you seen the news?" the first one read. My heart racing, I clicked the link she'd sent. The headline made my blood run cold: "Local businessman under investigation for financial misconduct." The article was vague on details, but one line jumped out at me. Sources close to the family suggest that the recent divorce of Thomas Henderson may have brought certain discrepancies to light. I sat there, stunned. Was this because of our divorce proceedings? Had the scrutiny of our finances unveiled something bigger? I thought back to all the times I'd questioned our lavish lifestyle, only to be brushed off by Tom. "Don't worry your pretty little head about it," he'd say, patting my hand like I was a child. Had I been living in the middle of something corrupt without even realizing it? My phone buzzed again, Sophia calling. I answered, my voice shaky. "Did you see?" she asked without preamble. "Yeah," I managed. "Sophia, I don't know how to feel about this." She was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to feel anything, Sarah. This is his mess, not yours." But even as she said it, I knew it wasn't that simple. My name had been tied to Tom's for years. What if people thought I was involved? What if this investigation dredged up parts of my past I'd rather leave buried? "I think I need to talk to Rachel," I said finally. "Just to be sure I'm protected, I guess." Sophia agreed, promising to check in later. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at nothing. The life I'd worked so hard to build over the past few months suddenly felt fragile, as if the ghosts of my past could come crashing through at any moment. But as the initial shock wore off, I felt something else stirring in my chest. Determination. I'd faced down Tom and Evelyn in court. I'd rebuilt my life from the ashes. Whatever storm was coming, I would weather it. I opened my laptop, navigating to my blog. My fingers hovered over the keys for a moment before I began to type. Sometimes, just when you think you've left the past behind, it comes roaring back. But here's the thing about storms. They're powerful, yes, but they're also temporary. And when they pass, they often leave the air clearer than before. As I wrote, I felt my resolve strengthening. This wasn't the end of my story. It was just another chapter, another challenge to overcome. And this time, I wasn't facing it alone. I had Sophia, Rachel, my readers, and most importantly, I had myself, stronger and wiser than I'd ever been before. The storm might be arriving, but I was ready to face it head-on. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity and emotion. After my initial shock at the news of Tom's investigation, I threw myself into preparation. Rachel, ever the voice of reason, advised me to gather any financial documents I still had access to, just in case. "Better safe than sorry," she said, her tone reassuring but firm. I spent evenings poring over old bank statements and tax returns, my dining table covered in a sea of papers. It was strange, seeing our life together reduced to numbers and transactions. Each receipt, each statement was a reminder of the life I'd left behind, but also of how far I'd come. Meanwhile, my blog continued to grow. I wrestled with whether to address the situation with Tom directly in my writing. In the end, I decided to write about it in general terms, focusing on the emotions and challenges of having your past resurface unexpectedly. The response was overwhelming. Comments poured in from women who'd faced similar situations, offering support and sharing their own stories of resilience. One comment, in particular, stuck with me. "You're not just rising from the ashes," a reader named Jessica wrote. "You're showing us all how to fly." Her words became a mantra for me in the difficult days that followed. It was a crisp autumn morning when I received the call that would change everything once again. I was at work, deep in concentration over a new marketing campaign, when my phone buzzed. Rachel's name flashed on the screen. "Sarah," she said, her voice tight with excitement. "We need to talk. Can you meet me for lunch?" An hour later, I sat across from Rachel in a small cafe, my sandwich untouched as she laid out the situation. "The investigation into Tom's finances has uncovered some irregularities," she explained, her eyes gleaming. "Specifically, there's evidence that he's been hiding assets for years. Assets that, legally speaking, you're entitled to a portion of." My mind reeled. Hiding assets? But how? Why? Rachel's smile was grim. "From what we can tell, it started around the time you got married. Tom's been funneling money into offshore accounts, underreporting income, the works. And here's the kicker, a lot of it seems to have been at Evelyn's suggestion." I sat back, stunned. All those times I'd questioned our finances, all the vague answers and dismissals, it all suddenly made sense. "What does this mean for me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "It means," Rachel said, leaning forward, "that we have grounds to reopen the divorce settlement. If we can prove Tom deliberately concealed these assets during the proceedings, you could be looking at a significantly larger settlement." The next few months were a blur of legal meetings, depositions, and sleepless nights. Tom's lawyers fought tooth and nail, but with each passing week, more evidence came to light. Emails between Tom and Evelyn discussing ways to hide money. Bank transfers to accounts in the Cayman Islands. Even a secret property in the Berkshires that I'd never known about. Through it all, I struggled with a mix of emotions. Part of me felt vindicated, finally seeing the truth of who Tom and Evelyn really were. But another part felt a deep sadness for the man I'd once loved, the life we'd once dreamed of building together. The final hearing was set for a chilly December morning. I woke early, my stomach in knots. As I dressed in the sharp blazer and pencil skirt Sophia had helped me pick out, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. The woman staring back at me looked confident, strong. A far cry from the broken person who'd walked out of that burning driveway all those months ago. The courtroom was packed. News of the case had spread, and it seemed like half of Boston's legal community had shown up to watch. I kept my eyes forward as I walked in, refusing to look for Tom or Evelyn in the crowd. As the judge entered and the proceedings began, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Whatever happened today, I knew I'd be okay. I had my job, my friends, my blog. I had myself. The judge's ruling, when it came, was decisive. "In light of the evidence presented," she said, her voice ringing through the silent courtroom, "this court finds that Mr. Henderson deliberately concealed assets during the initial divorce proceedings. As such, the previous settlement is hereby voided, and a new division of assets will be determined." A murmur ran through the courtroom. I sat still, barely breathing, as the judge continued, outlining the new terms. When she finished, Rachel squeezed my hand. "We did it," she whispered. As we left the courtroom, I caught sight of Tom for the first time. He looked defeated. Evelyn was nowhere to be seen. For a moment, our eyes met. I saw a flicker of something. Regret? Sorrow? Before he turned away. Outside, the December air was crisp and clean. Sophia was waiting, practically bouncing with excitement. "Well," she demanded. "What happened?" I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past year lifting from my shoulders. "It's over," I said simply. "Really, truly over." We celebrated that night, Sophia, Rachel, and I, raising glasses of champagne in my tiny apartment. As the evening wore on, the conversation turned to the future. "So, what's next for the rising phoenix?" Sophia asked, her eyes twinkling. I laughed, shaking my head. "Honestly, I'm not sure. For so long, everything's been about survival, about getting through the next challenge. Now," I trailed off, realizing the truth of what I was about to say. "Now, I can do anything." The next morning, I woke early, my head clear despite the champagne. I made coffee and settled at my laptop, opening a new document. The words flowed easily. "Dear readers, today marks the end of a long and difficult journey. But more importantly, it marks the beginning of something new. Something exciting. Something entirely of my own making. For so long, I defined myself by my relationships, by the expectations others placed on me. I thought I needed someone else to make me whole. But these past months have taught me that the only person who can truly complete you is yourself. So what's next? I don't know exactly. But I do know this: whatever comes, I'm ready for it. And I hope you'll join me on this next adventure. Here's to new beginnings, to rising from the ashes, and to the incredible strength we all have within us. With gratitude and hope, Sarah. As I hit publish on the post, I felt a sense of closure. The Sarah who had stood in that driveway, watching her possessions burn, was gone. In her place was someone stronger, wiser, and infinitely more hopeful. The settlement money would give me options I'd never had before. Maybe I'd go back to school, or start my own business. Maybe I'd travel, see all the places I'd always dreamed of but never dared to visit. But those were decisions for another day. For now, I was content to sit in my small but cozy apartment, sipping my coffee, and looking out at the Boston skyline. The future stretched out before me, full of possibility. As the sun rose higher in the sky, painting the city in shades of gold, I smiled to myself. Karma, it seemed, had triumphed. But the real victory wasn't in the courtroom or the settlement. It was here, in this moment, in the woman I'd become. Whatever came next, I was ready. More than ready, I was excited. For the first time in years, maybe in my entire life, I was truly, completely free. And that, I realized, was the greatest triumph of all. As winter melted into spring, I found myself standing at a crossroads. The legal battles were behind me, the settlement money was in the bank, and for the first time in my adult life, I had the freedom to choose my own path. It was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. I started small, allowing myself the luxury of time to really think about what I wanted. I took long walks through Boston Common, watching the city come back to life after the long winter. I tried new hobbies, painting classes, a beginner's rock climbing course, even a weekend workshop on creative writing. Each new experience felt like uncovering a piece of myself that had been buried for years. My blog continued to grow, evolving from a personal journal into something of a community. Women from all walks of life reached out, sharing their own stories of survival and rebirth. I found myself spending hours responding to comments and emails, offering words of encouragement and support. It was during one of these late-night writing sessions that an idea began to take shape. What if I could do more? What if I could take everything I'd learned, about resilience, about rebuilding, about finding strength in the darkest moments, and use it to help others? The next morning, I called Sophia. "I think I know what I want to do next," I said as soon as she picked up. "I'm all ears," she replied, and I could hear the smile in her voice. Over coffee at our favorite cafe, I laid out my plan. A non-profit organization, dedicated to helping women rebuild their lives after leaving abusive relationships. Legal advice, career counseling, financial literacy workshops, all the things I wished I'd had access to when I first walked out that door. Sophia listened intently, her eyes growing brighter with each detail. When I finished, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Sarah," she said softly, "this is amazing. You're going to change lives." The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. I threw myself into research, reaching out to domestic violence shelters, legal aid organizations, and other nonprofits in the area. I wanted to learn everything I could about the resources already available and where the gaps were. I also started taking business classes at a local community college, determined to build a solid foundation for my new venture. The classroom felt strange at first. I was older than most of my classmates, and there were moments when I felt out of place. But as the weeks went by, I found myself enjoying the challenge, rediscovering a love for learning that I'd forgotten I had. It was in one of these classes that I met Jasmine, a young woman with a sharp mind and a quiet determination that reminded me of myself. We were paired up for a group project, and as we worked together, she slowly opened up about her own past. Like me, she had left an abusive relationship, and was now working to build a new life for herself and her young daughter. "It's hard," she confessed one evening as we were wrapping up our work. "Some days, I wonder if I made the right choice. If I'm strong enough to do this on my own." I felt a surge of empathy, remembering my own doubts and fears. "You are," I told her firmly. "The fact that you're here, that you're trying, that's strength, Jasmine. And you're not alone." As I drove home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about Jasmine and all the other women out there facing similar struggles. It reinforced my determination to make my nonprofit a reality. Summer arrived, bringing with it a sense of renewed energy. I had a basic business plan in place, and with the help of Rachel's legal expertise, I began the process of officially registering my organization. We decided on a name, Phoenix Rising, a nod to my own journey and the transformative power of resilience. As word spread about what I was doing, I was overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. Former colleagues from my marketing days offered to help with branding and publicity. Local businesses reached out about partnerships and sponsorships. Even my landlord, a gruff but kind-hearted man named Joe, offered a discount on a larger space for our office. But the most surprising support came from an unexpected source. One sunny afternoon, as I was knee-deep in paperwork, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something made me answer. "Sarah." The voice on the other end was hesitant, familiar in a way that made my heart skip a beat. "It's Linda. Your old neighbor." I remembered our chance encounter at the coffee shop months ago. "Linda, hi. How are you?" There was a pause, and then Linda's words came in a rush. "I've been following your blog. What you're doing, with this new organization, it's wonderful, Sarah. I think it's something I could have used, years ago." As Linda shared her story, a past I'd never known about, of an abusive first marriage she'd escaped long before moving to our neighborhood, I felt a mix of emotions. Sadness for what she'd been through, anger at the system that had failed her, and a renewed sense of purpose. "I want to help," Linda said firmly. "Whatever you need, volunteers, fundraising, anything. Count me in." By the time autumn rolled around again, Phoenix Rising was more than just an idea. We had a small but dedicated team, an office space that buzzed with energy, and our first programs up and running. I split my time between administrative work, meeting with clients, and continuing to write and speak about domestic abuse and recovery. It wasn't always easy. There were late nights and early mornings, moments of doubt and frustration. But every time I met with a woman taking her first steps towards independence, every time I saw the spark of hope reignite in someone's eyes, I knew this was exactly where I was meant to be. 1 year to the day after the final court hearing that had changed my life, I found myself back in that same coffee shop where I'd started my blog. As I sipped my latte, I couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed. My phone buzzed with a text from Sophia, "Turn on the local news." Curious, I pulled out my tablet and navigated to the news site. And there it was, a feature story on Phoenix Rising, complete with interviews with some of the women we'd helped. As I watched, I felt tears prick at my eyes. These women, who had once been where I was, were now standing tall, speaking with confidence about their journeys and their hopes for the future. The bell above the door chimed, and I looked up to see Jasmine walk in. She spotted me and came over, her face glowing. "I got the job," she exclaimed, sliding into the seat across from me. "The one I told you about last week. I start on Monday." I reached across the table to squeeze her hand, my heart full. "Jasmine, that's wonderful. I'm so proud of you." As we chatted about her new job and her daughter's upcoming school play, I felt a sense of contentment wash over me. This was why I had started Phoenix Rising. Not just to help women escape bad situations, but to help them thrive afterwards. Later that evening, as I walked home through the bustling streets of Boston, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. The pain, the fear, the moments of despair, they were all part of my story. But they weren't the end of it. I thought about the woman I'd been, standing in that driveway watching my clothes burn. I wished I could go back and tell her that the fire that seemed to be destroying her life was actually forging her into something stronger, more resilient, more authentically herself. As I reached my apartment building, I paused for a moment, looking up at the stars just barely visible through the city lights. I thought about all the women out there who were where I had been, feeling lost and alone. And I made a silent promise, to keep fighting, to keep helping, to be the light that I had needed in my darkest moments. The future stretched out before me, full of possibilities and challenges. But I was ready for them. After all, I was a phoenix, reborn from the ashes. And my fire was just beginning to burn.